Okay, the first topic then for this morning is that of Central and South America. And as you see, we have four resource people. We will lead off with Bishop Remi De Roo. I'm not going to introduce him since I think you all know him well, and his short biography is in the brochure before us. Bishop Remi De Roo.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and good morning, friends. There's been a lot of news stories about Central and South America in the last few days, particularly Central America. You may recall the headlines, Reagan's peace plan on August the 5th. 2 days later in Guatemala, the presidents of 5 Central America countries, Nicaragua, Honduras, Salvador, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, got together and brought forward their own peace plan, suggesting that it was much better than what Reagan was indicating he wanted to see happen. And August the 10th in Sao Paulo, the foreign ministers of 8 countries, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela, came together to set a date for the presidents of all Latin America to discuss 3 basic areas: peace, the foreign debt, and economic integration. And that idea of economic integration brings me back to about 15 years ago when I was privileged to be in Panama visiting with my former confrere and friend, Archbishop Marcos McGrath, and representatives from all the countries of Latin America were together talking about the possibility of bringing all these different countries into a common vision. The Latin expression they used at that time was La Patria Grande. You know, one of the dreams of people in Latin America is that someday Latin America will become one. And I give you this as a preface to my very brief remarks. Let's never forget that we're dealing, depending on how you cut the geography, between 25 and 30 countries, all with different histories, many of them with very different populations, all with their own dreams and visions. It's very dangerous for us here to look at Latin America and try to apply our North American concepts, particularly when we oversimplify them and when we allow ourselves to be caught in the ideological trap that the media throw at us all the time, as if this was basically an issue of East versus West and whether you can keep peace through so-called democracy. That's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is a question of justice and the right of all these peoples to their own self-determination. And I posit these few points at the beginning so we can use them as a background. Let us never forget that it was European people primarily who in the 16th century brought the sword and the cross, sometimes too closely allied, and destroyed ancient civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas, and all the others, because of our desire to enrich ourselves at their expense, to spread the European powers, what we then called civilization, to the so-called savages. Let's not forget that it wasn't all that long ago, in terms of centuries, that Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas debated with a Spanish lawyer, Sepúlveda, before the Spanish court, whether or not the people of Latin America were truly human beings, and as a result, whether they could be baptized as full-fledged Christians, or whether they should be civilized, in quotations, and made into the equivalent of Europeans for their own well-being. I don't know how many have seen the film Mission. Don't miss a chance to see it if you haven't. It'll give you a little bit of that background. Because the European powers, mostly Spain and Portugal, but then followed by Germany, Britain, and more recently the United States and others, took over the leadership, out of that new alliance and the intermarriages, there grew a mixed race who, because of their greater access to education, gradually became the oligarchies that we know today and took over the leadership not only politically but also militarily and, yes, from a religious point of view, and have continued, these oligarchies have continued to exploit the millions of peasants who have been pushed aside from the more productive lands, mostly into the mountains. Meanwhile, the local oligarchies, in alliance with the multinationals, have pretty well distorted the economy of Latin America into export commodity cash crop production, which in direct proportion to its success is further diminishing the power of the peasants, who are the bulk of the population of Latin America, to feed themselves and to determine their own economic and political future. It's against this fundamental maldistribution of natural resources, particularly of land, and of unequal access to political power, that we have to understand what is happening in Latin America today. The political complexity of Latin America is horrendous for people like ourselves. We have to be very, very cautious before we judge those situations. We must especially avoid the ideological distortion that I referred to earlier, and not see Latin America simply as an East-West situation, but recognize that the fundamental question here is really the issue of justice, the right of these peoples to determine their own future. Now, I'm not saying that the ideology doesn't have something to do with it, but I've been to Latin America repeatedly, and the bogus accusation of communist infiltration and communist domination is not what really concerns people in Latin America. There is a certain arrogance on our part to think that these hundreds of millions of people with their own very rich cultures and their varied histories suddenly became the pawns of some ideas spawned in Europe, which we refer to as communism under its various titles. That's not the real issue. What the Latin American people really want is to be able to raise themselves out of the horrendous poverty to which they are now victims into a situation of self-determination in global interdependency. In the process, they have set up a variety of governments. Many of them, unhappily, are dictatorships, frequently supported by outside interests, and whether they are American or Russian interests is beside the point. The question is really whether we will recognize the right for Latin Americans to determine their own future and to seek their own place in the sun, an opportunity to bind themselves together in a common destiny. I offer those remarks, I think I'm under my 10 minutes by 30 seconds, as a background to your discussions.
Thank you very much. You've set a model for the rest of us to follow. Next speaker is Jean Davidson, who is director of the World Service and Development Committee of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Jean.
Thank you and good morning. I wanted to follow along with some of the mechanical aspects of how Canada is helping at the present time to assist Central Americans in raising themselves to self-determination and global interdependency. I think the speakers who follow are going to give some examples, some specifics of this, but I wanted to outline the basics of Canadian aid and proposed changes in Canadian aid, not just in Central America, but generally. But before I did that, I just wanted to add a personal comment in terms of the emotional impact that has come to me from meeting a number of Central Americans who tell the most poignant and heartrending stories of their experiences, their attempts to exist in a normal everyday life, their feelings that every step they take may be their last, yet the faith and determination they have to go on with the work they are doing in very dangerous circumstances. In terms of Canada's response, there are a number of vehicles by which aid flows from us to other countries. The largest component is called bilateral aid, which means from the Canadian government to the government of another country. This is fraught with various diplomatic complications in that aid cannot be particularly directed or monitored. And so the government of Canada has indicated much more a preference to work with a number of other vehicles. One is the multilateral aid, which goes from a Canadian organization through an international organization to that counterpart in another country, such as the Canadian Red Cross to the International Red Cross to the Red Cross in another country. I think the largest aid in the multilateral division goes to the international branch of Planned Parenthood. The darling of the Canadian government aid program is the non-government organizations vehicle, because it is felt that to provide funds to a Canadian non-government organization to support a non-government organization in another country is often more reliable, more accountable, and more effective in reaching the actual people in need. There has been a commission for about a year and a half under the leadership of William Weingart reviewing the basics of Canadian aid, and they have just released a preliminary report called Aid for Whose Benefit. The reason I wanted to focus on this morning is because there is still time for further input from the Canadian public in shaping the directions of the policies of our aid program to other countries. I wanted to cite a few of the specific recommendations that have been made in the preliminary report. The three overall aims are to help the poorest countries and the poorest peoples of the world, to strengthen the institutional capacities of countries to solve their own problems, and to ensure that development priorities are foremost in the spending of overseas development assistance funds. Well, those sound fine, but how are they going to get around some of the nitty-gritty issues? One of the major concerns that affects aid to Central America is whether or not there should be a criteria of human rights or a lack of human rights violations in a country before government-to-government aid is given. The report addressed this by saying that there should be some sort of human rights grid ranging from negative to positive, so that if a government is judged guilty of gross and systematic abuse of the people, it would be ineligible for government-to-government aid. However, that would not penalize the people who are already suffering to the extent of canceling all aid. Non-government organizations would be asked to take up some of the slack and in very carefully targeted programs, carry on programs there. This would be made on the basis of some very careful evaluations of the record of human rights abuses. In terms of military spending, there is often concern that if we provide aid, that frees up money for countries to buy arms. And the report came very clearly to the conclusion that our aid should not allow countries to spend more on the military than it otherwise would, and that there should be restrictions on Canadian arms exports to prevent them being used in violation of human rights. And our hands are not entirely clean in that regard right now. They also talked about tied aid, which is the policy of allotting a certain amount of aid to a particular country, but putting a lot of conditions on it, such as the aid must be Canadian goods manufactured here and plunked into a country where they may not be the most appropriate kind of item. This would allow more choice, more initiative in developing countries to produce the goods that are needed for a neighboring country, for instance. So they urged a substantial cutback from 80% of the bilateral aid to be Canadian goods to only 50%, which would allow for not only common sense, but for some encouragement of production in the developing world. They also addressed food aid, which is fraught with difficulties and complications. It may be detrimental to food production in developing countries. It may introduce into the diet undigestible items or things that may alter the diet of the local people so that they continue to rely on external food. The churches had made a number of presentations, the individual denominations, the Canadian Council of Churches, and a number of local groups from the 10 Days for World Development Network. And I think this has shown that local groups can be effective in influencing the thinking of government committees. For a number of the recommendations had been those that had been expounded by the churches. I think, as I said, there's still time for influence in the final shape of this report in terms of support for some of the recommendations or concerns for some other aspects. The concerns that the churches still had was that the development education that has been much a part of the CEDA program seems to be sliding more into public relations for CEDA rather than actual education programs which can challenge and question and bring awareness to Canadians. I think the one specific example I wanted to cite of concern for aid in Central America was something called the Counterpart Funding Program in El Salvador, which was a proposal that Canada donate fertilizer to El Salvador, government to government, which would then be sold through their agriculture programs, creating a large pool of El Salvador currency. This money would be allotted by the government of El Salvador to various non-government organizations in the country. Now this raised a number of alarms, particularly the fact that the government of El Salvador would have such sweeping control and knowledge of the programs of non-government organizations. That's not to say that they're involved in illicit activities or covert activities, but that it could greatly endanger a number of people working in development to be compromised by the influence of funds allotted by the government of El Salvador. And so this is the one major item of concern that the churches are working on. This is being repeated in Peru, in Jamaica, in a number of other countries, and it's the churches consider this a fairly dangerous direction and are working to get some variations and improvements in that. I think I would like to stop there.
Thanks very much, Jean. By the way, how much more time is there for the Weingart report?
Well, the basic responses were to be back by the end of July, but there is some time until about the end of August to make views known to Mr. Clark, the minister, before it comes to the committee. And I don't know, perhaps recalling Parliament early will alter that schedule so that there will be more time. I'm not sure how that complication works.
Okay, thanks. The next speaker is Lois Wilson, who needs no introduction because Lois Wilson is Lois Wilson.
I'm going to attempt to make two contributions. The first one will be on the critique of liberation theology by women in Latin America, and it comes out of the Central America situation, and the second 5 minutes will be on the situation of foreign debt coming out of the South American situation, particularly Brazil and Argentina. And to make the first one, I need the assistance of my sister. We're going to kind of read something. I'm not sure how. Well, we need another chair.
Here, do you want to sit here?
Okay. If I could introduce this, first of all, I want to read something to you from the documentation of the Third World Theologians' Base Communities, the section written by Latin American women, where it has this to say: the role of women in South America has found its reflection in both the presence and absence of women in the church. The church has helped to reinforce the ideology of the ruling class concerning women, elaborating a brand of charity that is meant to offer assistance and protection to women, since that is what they need. The church has read and interpreted biblical and theological tradition with these characteristics. First, the permanent absence of the women's question as a specific focus for theological reflection. Second, the presence of the women's problem as preoccupation with sexual morals and charitable assistance. You got that one. Third, the absence of any theological reflection that incorporates the women's question in the mainstream. The church is not elaborating any theological reflection that has been reformulated on the basis of the alternatives posed by feminism. And finally, their statement: if liberation theology is to mature in America, we must adopt every effort to incorporate elements specifically rooted in the situation of women into any and all theological articulations. That's from Latin American women. Now, there have been some attempts made and some progress made in this area, and what we're going to read for you is the transcript of one of the commentaries coming out of the base community that Ernesto Cardenal had in the late 60s on the island of Salta and Nima in Lake Managua in Nicaragua. And this particular one is the commentary of the Roman Catholic community on the Virgin Mary and the kind of theological understanding that that community has, which has implications, of course, for the role of women in Central and South America. Marjorie's going to play the role of the priest, and I'm going to be the responsive community.
Today is September 12. Does that mean anything special to you?
Well, 3 years ago yesterday, Allende was killed in Chile, and the Chileans lost their leader. Now they're suffering great repression. Allende's death makes me think of the death of Mao, and their deaths make me think of the death of Martin Luther King.
Why do you think of the deaths of those three together?
Because all three of them were concerned about oppressed peoples.
Is there any connection between Allende and Mayo and Martin Luther King and Mary?
Well, I guess that would depend on whether Mary was concerned about oppressed peoples too.
Let me read part of Mary's song, the Magnificat, in the beginning of Luke's Gospel. God has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of low degree. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent empty away.
Bravo, but Father, that doesn't sound at all like the Mary we hear about in the cathedral. And the Mary in the Holy Picture certainly doesn't look like a person who would talk that way.
Tell us about the Mary in the Holy Pictures.
Well, here she is. She's standing on a crescent moon. She's wearing a crown. She has rings on her fingers. She has a blue robe embroidered with gold.
That does sound like a different Mary from the Mary of the song. Do you think the picture has betrayed the Mary of the song?
The Mary who said that God has exalted those of low degree would not have left all of her friends so she could stand on the moon. Take her off the moon. The Mary who said that God has put down the mighty from their thrones would not be wearing a crown either. So take off her crown. The Mary who said that God has sent the rich empty away would not be wearing rings on her fingers. Take off her rings. The Mary who said that God has filled the hungry with good things would not have left people who were still hungry to wear a silk robe embroidered with gold. Take off her robe. But Father, this isn't right. I mean, that would be a striptease of the Virgin Mary.
Very well. If you don't like the way Mary looks in this picture, what do you think of the Mary of the song? What do you think the Mary of the song would look like?
Well, she'd not be standing on the moon. She'd be standing in the dirt and the dust where I stand. She'd not be wearing a crown. She'd have on an old hat like the rest of us to keep the sun from causing her to faint. She wouldn't be wearing jeweled rings on her fingers. She'd have rough hands like mine. And she wouldn't be wearing a silk robe embroidered with gold. She'd be wearing old clothes like the rest of us. Father, it's awful to say this, but it sounds as though Mary would look something like me. My feet are dirty, my hat is old, my hands are rough, my clothes are torn.
No, I don't think it is awful to say that. I think the Mary you have described is more like the Mary of the Bible than the Mary we hear about in the cathedral and see in the Holy Pictures.
Well, I think she'd be more at home here in the slum with us than in the cathedral or the general mansion. And I think her message is more hopeful for us than for them. They're mighty and rich, but she tells them that God puts down the mighty from their thrones and sends the rich away empty. And we're at the bottom of the heap, but she tells us that God exalts those of low degree and fills the hungry with good things.
Now let's see, how could we begin to help God bring those things to pass?
Okay, there'll be more on this tonight when we talk about the culture of patriarchy. I have a few minutes 5 minutes to talk about another situation concerning Latin America, particularly South America. And I'm taking some of my material from a very good publication issued by GATFly, which, as you may know, is the ecumenical coalition of many of the churches in Canada, GATT standing for General Agreement on Trades and Tariff. And they have issued a booklet which I'll leave back on the freebie shelf back there, but don't take it. A booklet called Debt, Bondage, or Self-Reliance. As you may know, so many of the countries of the two-thirds world are in debt to the first world. And I think the parallel for me that I draw is what I know of the North American Indians, particularly northern Manitoba Crees and the Hudson Bay Company. I remember visiting there in the late 40s because my sister and her husband were with the United Church up north. And I soon became aware that the Indians were also in debt bondage for life. That is, they would come into the store with their furs to sell. The price for the furs would be set by the Hudson Bay factor who would buy them. If they didn't have enough for groceries, he would loan them a little bit so they could buy groceries. He would, of course, add interest for the repayment of that loan, and they would come in the next time unable to pay the loan and hardly able to pay the interest on the loan, and therefore they were in perpetual debt bondage. Now, that's a very simplistic way of saying what's happening vis-a-vis the first world and some of the countries in South America. In South America, landowners get tenant farmers into debts which they cannot repay. They have to make all their purchases usually at a company store, and they're unable, in other words, to ever get out of debt. Recently, the Brazilian Bishops' Pastoral Commission denounced a company in Brazil which is owned by Volkswagen, which issues contracts through middlemen who then use that to get workers who are obliged to pay back a certain amount through deductions to their wages to the middleman. And since their earnings are so low and the cost of the company store are so high, they are constantly in debt. This particular thing has now reached epidemic proportions. One of the main instruments for attempting to deal with it is the International Monetary Fund. This is an instrument which came out post-war World War II, as so much of our legislation and our world institutions came out of that time, may have been very apropos then, but are completely out of date now, as you'll hear also around the refugee legislation, which came out of that era. My thesis is that you should know as much about the International Monetary Fund as you know about the Apostles' Creed. Or maybe you don't know anything about the Apostles' Creed, but certainly in any catechetical classes that the International Monetary Fund should be taught as well. It was set up to really stabilize international monetary policy, but has turned into an instrument perceived by the two-thirds world of immense repression. I remember I've learned a lot about this by listening to South Americans. In Uruguay, one woman pointed to the fluorescent light and she said, that light bulb cost us $1, but 75 cents of it has to go back to pay the interest to the International Monetary Fund for the wonderful loan they made us to put fluorescent lights in here. And so it goes on and on. The results of the IMF, as well as intentioned as it perhaps was thought to be, although it was carefully instrumented to make the U.S. have it already has most of the votes in it and looked after its own interests. The results are massive unemployment, low wages in order to repay the interest, not even the principal, therefore riots, therefore keeping people on low wages in place by strict militarism, distorting of development priorities. One of my colleagues in South Korea, when I was questioning him about the way in which they have said that there are to be no unions in South Korea, although you may have noticed in the papers recently that there are riots to try and get unions. The reason that they have not allowed them is because they want to keep the wages low to repay the debt to the International Monetary Fund. Briefly, Canada's record here is to say the Canadian banks, for example, have said that big write-offs of debts are simply not in the cards. And if the interest rates on those loans to Latin America should be reduced at all, the particular profits of the Canadian banks would be cut as follows: 20% loss for the Royal Bank, 32% for the Bank of Commerce, 34% for the Bank of Montreal, 25% for the Bank of Nova Scotia, 17% for the Toronto Dominion Bank. So they're not about to do anything about it, folks, because they would hear from you, because your standard of living would be affected, and then we're into it. What's becoming obvious is that the interests of both the northern and the southern hemispheres are now in jeopardy because these debts cannot be repaid, and the international community may never recover the dollars it splashed around in loans to developing countries. Some proposals have been made, mostly for tinkering with the existing system, that is, allowing them more time to repay the debts. The most radical one has been a call for a new international monetary system to rewrite the rules for trade. You may be interested to know that Michael Wilson has shown no interest in that at all, and that we're simply still running around within the kind of system which was established post-World War II, which is not adequate for the 1980s, 90s, or the year 2000.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thanks to Marjorie also for taking part in that dialogue. Our final speaker this morning in this panel is Vicki Obedkoff, who is a volunteer with the Canadian Jesuit Refugee Program, has grown up in the Castlegar area and maintained connections with friends on justice issues here. Vicki.
Thanks. I have in front of me a handicraft made by refugees from Guatemala, and they're on purses like this, and other crafts are on display in the next room for you to buy or look at. It's one of the many ways that local people are in solidarity with refugees by bringing the crafts and selling them. I'd like to spend the remaining few minutes talking about refugees coming to us from Central America. When I mentioned this, and also two horrible bills which our federal government is busting themselves to try to pass, When I arrived, I was told that immigrants and refugees aren't really a local issue, but I felt a bit justified seeing the headlines in the Nelson Daily News yesterday talking about the new bill, which is meant ostensibly to cut out those who abuse the system. My personal connection with the refugee issue maybe goes back to my own roots with the Doukhobor people, who were refugees at the turn of the century from Russia and went on to clear much of the land around the Castlegar area and work together to make some economic progress. So I grew up with some stories about refugees and persecution and dreams of working together to make an economic improvement, and some pain around losing some of that land when times were tough. I'd like to move to the story of Guatemala briefly. My experience isn't there. I've spent some time in Nicaragua and was very comfortable there in the mountains with people also trying to work together to improve their lot. But Guatemala is in a very desperate situation. As you probably know, a handful of people own most of the arable land. Most of that land grows to growing coffee and sugar and cotton, not food for children to eat, but to be sent as exports to make money to pay the debt, as Lois has just pointed out. We could go back into the horror show of the 50s when there was a brief period of democracy. A man named Arbenz tried to make some reforms to give land back to peasants, unused land that was owned by sugar companies from the United States and fruit companies from the United States. This precipitated a CIA coup, and the country's become hell on earth ever since in terms of series of military dictatorships. Thousands of people were killed then, and a resurgence of killings began in the late 1970s. This time, Indian people who'd worked hard to clear barely arable land in the mountains refused to leave their land. The pattern goes like this. Indians would go up, not own the title to the land, clear it. Maybe after 8 years it would produce corn. And when the land was starting to bear fruit, large landowners would come and magically produce titles to the land, chasing the Indians away, who compose 90% of Guatemala's population. This is a country of 8 million people. The Indians resisted. Local villages decided to work together to keep their plots of corn. The alternative was starvation or working for very low wages on plantations on the coast. And genocide was practiced against the people to levels to which are unbelievable to us. 1 million people during that time were displaced in Guatemala. Some ran away into the mountains with the clothes on their back, and one group of people lived on roots and leaves and herbs for 5 years. My friend who gave me this purse spent 3 months in Guatemala, and she talks about a little girl named Esperanza, which means hope in Spanish, born to these people who hid in the mountains for 5 years and recently came down and are being held in safety in a hospital protected by the local bishop. Anyway, many more Guatemalans were rounded up. The survivors of the army massacres were rounded up to live in so-called model villages in Guatemala. That's what's happening now, where the army comes in, corrals people together, and gives them food for a program called Beans and Bullets, so that if people take up arms and inform on each other, then they're entitled to food. And Dan Heap, my MP in Toronto, has seen Canadian food aid being administered by the army. It's an example of what Jean pointed out about how our aid, if given to a government that really doesn't run the show, the army runs the show, ends up in the hands of, it ends up oppressing people further. Anyway, about 1 million Guatemalans are scattered in Mexico and the United States, some in Nicaragua. As you may know, in November, just a brief mention about the refugees in Mexico. Mexico has tried its darndest, really, but they're a poor country, and recently have been cooperating with the Guatemalan government to allow refugees to go back, supposedly where they'll be safe in Guatemala. In fact, they're being killed when they return. It's not safe to go back to Guatemala right now. Many other Guatemalans have lived illegally or underground in the United States. But in November, the U.S. passed harsh new laws aimed at deporting illegals back to Central America. It's impossible to legally be a refugee in the United States if you're Guatemalan. 99% of Guatemalan claims are rejected and deported. So one has to live underground, without papers, without legal documents. In November, when the U.S. passed harsh new laws, we had a wave back east coming over the border through Buffalo into Fort Erie, one of our border towns, southeast of Toronto. This stream has been steadily increasing. And I should tell you one story of hope. The town of Fort Erie, about the size of Nelson, has been remarkable in helping people. Very ordinary people, up to 200 will come out to a meeting. Over 200 to 300 homes are safe homes where Central Americans will wait their refugee hearings. Anyway, the streams of the trickles are increasing to a stream, not because Central Americans want to come here, it's because they're being chased out. They can't go home and they can't stay in the United States. Canada is the last hope of a chance to come, and now that hope is being taken away by 2 new bills. This gets into technicalities. I don't have much time to go into it, but I have a testimonies from Central American refugees, and particularly a blue pamphlet called When Someone Asks. And it asks the gut-level questions that Canadians are asking now. For example, why shouldn't refugees have to line up like other immigrants? Aren't there enough Canadians looking for jobs without refugees making it worse? You know, the kind of stuff you may wonder yourself, I've wondered it, or the kind of stuff you hear at coffee break. It's a very good series. We ask the question, put out a little bit of information, and include a cartoon or a graph that gets the message across. These are available for 50 cents in the back room in a display table, and the kit itself costs $6 if you want to get the whole story. I just want to spend a minute describing the worst bill of all, Bill C-84. Do I have one more minute left? Basically, up until now, any person coming across the border who says they're a refugee is allowed to tell their story. Unfortunately, the rules have been so complex, this process can drag on for 5 years, and it's invited some abuse. The government now is throwing out the baby with the bathwater and bringing in a sledgehammer to correct some examples of, or to correct some instances of abuse. For example, under proposed legislation, refugee claimants can be held for 1 month without a chance to tell their story. And after that month, they can be sent back to their countries of origin. Someone who arrives without any valid documents can be held for a month without a refugee hearing and sent back. As I've just explained, perhaps many Central Americans can't possibly hope to get a hold of legal documents. There was a case in Guatemala recently. A young woman, 26 years old, had her papers all ready for her, waiting. And on her way to get them, she was abducted and killed. Stuff like that happens all the time, even if you're able to get legal documents. The government has come down with a sledgehammer to keep out people who ostensibly are abusing. The real effect will be to clamp down on real refugees. It's now going to be a crime, for example, for those people in Fort Erie, ordinary, decent Canadians, to help a refugee without documents. If one of you is caught helping a refugee without valid documents, you can now go to jail for 5 years if this new bill passes. The bill is supposed to stop smugglers who bring the boat people over the oceans. In fact, it's written in such a way that it also applies to church people helping legitimate refugees. And a coalition back east has come up with a way to have fair, fast hearings for people, to weed out abusers, but to keep the doors open for genuine refugees. So this is atrocious legislation. It's probably the worst in Canadian history. And I'd really encourage you, if you can't buy the kit, you're welcome to look through it and read it at coffee break. I'll be back in there so I can collect your money. The Globe and Mail on Wednesday, if you want to go to Cutler's and pick one up, gives a good description of the new bill in a thumbnail sketch. Is that it? Okay.
Well done. Thank you very much. Remarkably well-disciplined panel. We now have about 20 minutes for questions of clarification from any and all of you from the floor. So would you put your statement in the form of a question to one member of the panel, or if you like, to all members? There's a microphone here. Is there another one back? There's one up here anyway. Or I guess you can just speak from where you are. Who wants to be first? Yes.
Can anybody, first of all, tell me why all the noise on the microphone? Is somebody kicking the microphone somewhere? I can't hear that.
Are we too close to the microphones?
Don't get so close to the microphone. You can just sit normally where that they should pick up. It's really hard to change it.
Okay.
So if you could ask if people would use the microphone.
All right. Yeah, we have been too close to the microphones, so hopefully we'll correct that. Yes, would people please use the microphone when they raise questions, but again, don't get too close to it.
It's going to be hard. They've not heard anything.
I think they did.
I have a question for Lois Wilson or anybody else in the panel.
Would you like to come up to the mic, or one of the mics, please?
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am aware of the name of the organization, but I'd appreciate it if you could clarify in 30 words or less, the workings of the International Monetary Fund and how it is involved in directing aid from one country to another.
Wait a minute till I get it straight. Wrong one. Again, there's a handout. There's lots of things you can read, which is probably more reliable than my 30 seconds. It was set up to stabilize the post-war international economy and to make secure U.S. economic penetration of Europe and the Third World. And my understanding was that shift of power came when Britain was declining and the U.S. was ascending. And Britain tried to make some proposals which would have been more equitable and fair, but they didn't have the power base to do so. And so the U.S. really shaped it according to their own needs. It's headquartered in Washington, D.C. It began operations in 1947. And the stated purposes are to promote international monetary cooperation, to contribute to the promotion and maintenance of high levels of employment and the development of productive resources for all members. In fact, it's not able to do that because of the way it operates. It has 141 member countries. The voting weight is proportional to their financial contribution, so that the U.S., with around 20% of the quota, dominates the decision-making, along with industrialized countries of Western Europe and Canada, controlling approximately 50% of the rest of the vote. One of its main functions is to extend loans to member countries under a number of credit facilities. To gain access to a loan, the borrowing country must submit a letter of intent, which outlines the economic policies and how they're going to get that money to pay it back. And if the letter of intent says, yes, we'll comply with the conditions that you lay down, one of the conditions being you'll produce exports, which will generate profits for the creditor. The loans are approved and dispersed in chunks over a period up to 3 years. The fund monitors the economic situation of that country and withholds loans if targets set out in the letter of intent are not met. In other words, if a country pays their workers too high wages, that does not allow the country to make the profits to pay back the loan, and so they're not allowed any more loans. It's cut off in mid-air. And what I'm saying is the International Monetary Fund sets the criteria for the loans, imposes those upon the country that needs the loan. If the country doesn't shape up, they're cut off. The IMF is increasingly coming under criticism by its third world members for imposing overly harsh conditions on its loan, for discriminating against countries which allow economic and political development models distasteful to the USA, by applying political criteria to loans rather than strictly economic and technical ones. In other words, they don't loan to everybody, particularly if they're in the communist ambit, and for imposing conditions destructive to internal prosperity, which lead to reduced employment and slower economic growth. So they lay on these conditions of repaying the loan, and many countries are now saying, like, we will not do that anymore. Some countries, I think it was Peru, said we're simply not going to repay. Some of the other countries are saying that's not the way to do it. Let's just say, well, we can't do it right now, so we need another loan. And then, and so 20 years from now, they'll say we need another loan. But the whole system is going to collapse at some point, and we're going to feel the repercussions because there is an indivisibility in the economic system. And those who are crying for some reform are saying it needs to be not just a reform within that system, but the whole instrumentality of the International Monetary Fund is not valid for the kind of world in which we live. It may have been okay 40 years ago, but it is not now. Some countries are turning to private banks, but they are more and more hesitant to loan because they know they're going to lose their money. So you've got, a lot of South America now clearly unable ever to repay their loans. They can't even repay the interest. And what's happening is now they're extending the time limit, which isn't going to do anything except push off the evil day. And there seems no disposition except by some of the third world countries to come together to really talk about a serious alternative, a radical alternative. So that's a question of politics, political will.
Thanks, Lois.
Early this year in June, actually, I had the privilege of attending the World Congress of Women in Moscow, where over 2,800 women gathered to discuss problems of peace and development and equality of women. And I was really impressed to hear the views of some of the women from the developing nations. Apparently, the third world debt collectively is something in the order of 1,000 billion now.
1,000 billion.
Yep. But they have already paid in interest so far 922 billion. And they, as you've pointed out, Dr. Wilson, they cannot pay. They cannot continue to pay the interest on this tremendously crushing foreign debt, which is taking food out of the mouths of the children. Education programs, social programs are just being sacrificed to this. So I was wondering, what is the position of the Canadian Council of Churches and of church leaders on the non-payment of this debt, and for the establishment of what the women were saying in Moscow as a new international economic order in which the resources of the nations of the world would be used for the benefit of the population of those nations?
Where on earth did I put that thing? I do have the statement of the World Council of Churches. I don't know what the Canadian Council of Churches is doing these days. Maybe somebody else does. The World Council of Churches has, because it is an international forum and hears these things all the time from our member churches, has urged that the countries that extend the loans consider that they themselves are part of the problem, which is the first step, because most countries don't. They consider it a problem only of the two-thirds world, because after all, they won't pay back the debts, forgetting that we, in fact, urged them to take the loan, that the schedule of repayments be renegotiated, that a UN conference on new terms for trade and tariffs be instituted, which would be based on 4 principles, some of which escape me, but one is that there be full participation, equal votes, so that nobody dominates the decision-making, that that's the principle of universality, that there be accountability to each country, and in essence, that they sit down around the negotiating table and do that. The World Council comes around the theme of oikumene, which is the whole inhabited world. There's another Greek word, oikonomia, from which comes economics. And we talk a lot about the way in which the economic system has been arranged. The trade agreements has been really an arrangement of death for most people in the world. And that at some point we have to look after our household, the oikumene, in much more humane terms. So the World Council has said those general policy things, but I don't know how many churches have really gone to the governments over it. Maybe somebody else knows. My guess is not many. Part of the problem is GATFLY, which is a very strong ecumenical coalition, is a GATFLY. It runs around on the fringes, which is the best place to be always. And it pokes at the churches, but the churches are very conservative institutions and will not move.
There are interesting voices coming out of Latin America. I know of 3 different situations already where Roman Catholic bishops, whom I happen to know personally, have advanced the position that the global debt is not a debt in the first place, because it was engendered under circumstances where there was not a willing contract and full knowledge of what was happening. Secondly, that the conditions which are presently being imposed on the nations are beyond the realm of justice, so that strictly speaking there is not a moral contract, and that as a result the countries in Latin America would be morally justified in simply refusing to repay what is not really a debt in a moral sense. And I suspect that that voice will be heard increasingly. It's already causing pretty serious tremors among the powers that be. And I wouldn't be at all surprised you could see countries like Brazil, for instance, who may be among the first to do it, come forward with a position that they simply no longer recognize the debt as a binding debt, and they would have the support of the church.
Sure. My brief comment to push that image further is to think of debt in terms of theft, that much of the money borrowed went to an elite. It didn't go to pay for programs to help the majority of people in developing countries, and they're now being robbed of their labor power and land to pay back the so-called debt. Just one other comment. I'm part of a group trying to do some education about the debt in Toronto, and one image we good Canadians have is bad managers. If you're in debt somehow, you've overextended yourself and it's your own fault. And I think that's a tough image to work with, and we need to do some of that on a personal level. Our situation here is very different as from people in developing countries.
I find that very reassuring when you say that.
Whoa.
Any other questions?
I'm looking for a statement of hope from somebody in the panel. If you can possibly cite an example anywhere in Latin America where farmers are beginning to move out of bondage, are growing food for their own consumption on the land on a small or large scale. Is that happening anywhere?
Not only farmers, but a whole country reorganized its economy on that basis, and the case is Nicaragua. And now I can speak from first-hand experience because I had the privilege of sitting beside the Jesuit, Father Javier Gorestiaga, who is the economist that was borrowed from his research center in Panama and headed up the team of specialists who drew up the plan for the economic recovery of Nicaragua after the revolution. And that plan is based on allowing competent peasants to actually own land that has been sometimes expropriated. For instance, about a quarter to one-third of the agricultural holdings in Nicaragua were in the hands of the Somoza family, and those have been expropriated. But also land that has been bought back from multinational corporations and entrusted to cooperatives. Those cooperatives are actually working, not completely successfully under certain circumstances because of the insurrection, but I have been to some of those. And it is official government policy to support this effort to allow the people to regain their own control over their land. The big question is whether or not outside forces, regardless of where they come from, will allow this experiment to happen in Nicaragua. And I think one of the main reasons why you see such determined resistance to the Nicaraguan experience and such deliberate misrepresentation of what's happening in Nicaragua, ideologically, politically, commercially, economically, and culturally, at the educational level, is because the colonial powers who want to keep control over Latin America are afraid that if Nicaragua succeeds, many other countries in Latin America will want to follow the same example, and as a result will declare their own autonomy and set up their own independent economy. As you know, the Nicaraguan economy is set up on the basis of what they call the four wheels or the four legs. In other words, Nicaragua is officially committed to commercial relationships of 1/4 of their commerce, their economics, with the European bloc, 1/4 with the North American Western bloc, 1/4 with the non-aligned, and 1/4 with what is sometimes called the communist bloc. And that's done deliberately in such a way that no major outside power will be able to control the Nicaraguan economy. And Nicaragua is the first country ever, third world country, that was able to set its own conditions for the repayment of its loans to the World Bank. I know because Javier himself negotiated them, worked with the team. And they said to the World Bank, while we could make a case that the Somoza debts are not debts of Nicaragua, because they were never done in the name of the people, and we never saw that money, yet we will act in such a way as to recognize that we must try to repay those debts, but we will repay them according to our own conditions. We will not repay them by lowering the living standards of our people. And they were well on their way to repaying them before the insurrection caused the turmoil that has now put Nicaragua in such a difficult situation. But that is a living example of what is actually happening now.
Lois, yes.
I see several signs of hope. One is in the hopeful end of military dictatorships in Argentina and Brazil. So there's a new opening politically in both those countries. Secondly, I sat in a base community, a Catholic-based community in Buenos Aires, in some of the most wretched slums I've ever been in, while a young, illiterate 17-year-old expounded to us Romans 8, that section on hope, and was telling us how hopeful the situation is now because they have become a self-reliant community. And the third is that I find it very hopeful that many more people in certainly in the two-thirds world now know the situation and are aware of it. And that's taking charge of your own history. I brought along, and I'll leave this on the back table, an apparat I brought from Chile. I got from the Vicariate of Solidarity, and it shows the rich and the poor. These, and the military, the little people in green, keeping the poor out of the pockets of the rich. You can't get these out of Chile now except you smuggle them because the government will lift them at customs because they're so politically volatile, which shows, I mean, that's a sign of hope to me that the government is scared of these people living in slums who know their situation. The thing that is not so hopeful is that not many people in the first world are able to analyze the situation.
Thanks, Lois. Remi? I'm going to call now on Haddon Gregory, if you will tell us how to move from this plenary session into discussion groups.
Good morning. The facilitators for the groups met yesterday, and there's been a number of changes that have happened since then, and I think needs to be made clear. We hope to break here at 10:30, within a couple of minutes. You then have time for a coffee break, and by 10:40 we hope 10:40 you will be in your groups, and they will continue until 11:30. And then we will be meeting back here at 11.
They're getting more comfortable. It's really tough growing up. There's a big chasm between wasps and bluebirds.
I bet, yeah.
And it's getting better. There's a lot of hard feelings both ways, too.
When you went to the United Church, eh?
Yeah. Oh, man. But it's okay. Like now, when I come home, I can participate in the peace stuff that particulars do. It's kind of a common interest. So that's what we have in common.
That's great. And your father? Your father about the same as your mother, on it?
Yeah. He grew up very traditionally did work.
Well, I was brought up with missionary parents, and they wanted me to go at first to be a minister, but I started the Humanist Club on the campus of the University of Toronto.
Really?
At some point in time, will you announce that there will be tapes available?
All right. Questions and comments. The procedure we will follow is to try to cover, all of the questions first and then come back and look at the comments. This may not be possible within the period of time that we have, but we will keep these comments as they're valuable and try to deal with them somehow through this weekend. But we will make a beginning on it now. The first question from group 1 and 2 is this. Our main question is, what can we do, A, to educate ourselves and others, and B, to act? And they have two parts to this. A, educate us and others about governments, multinationals, and other organizations which affect the plight of Latin America. And B, how to act effectively, that is, by writing and to whom, boycotting, or other means of pressing for social change. So that's a question with a number of aspects to it, and I'll ask members of the panel if they would like to address themselves. Who would like to begin this easy question?
Let me see it again. I thought you were going to go through the whole works, so I wasn't. Yeah, you start, yeah.
I'll start while they're thinking about it. First of all, recognize the value of what you're doing right here, right now. This is wonderful. With specific regard to Latin America, I think back to 1975 when I first started sharing my insights in Central America as a result of my visits there. And there were very, very few groups like yours around. But that has caught on, and I have watched this literally explode. There's a fascinating movement going on, and you're part of it. So that's a sign of hope. Somebody asked earlier, give us some signs of hope. You people are signs of hope. Don't underestimate your own power. So do the little things that you personally can do. Write letters to leaders, wherever, here and abroad. Now, specifically coming from Latin America, when I asked the question in Latin America, what can we do to help you? I got several answers, and I'll share some of them with you. One of them, the bitter pill that I found hard to swallow, said, go home and convert yourself. Because if you don't change your attitude, if you don't change your mentality, if you don't change your culture in North America, you are part of the problem. Because we are part of those who, by quotes, living high off the hog and enjoying our privileges that the third world couldn't possibly enjoy, we're part of that oppression. And I know we don't do it deliberately, but at least begin to recognize that we're part of the problem and that we have to change our attitudes. And Canada is not innocent, by the way. We sometimes indulge in American bashing. It's a kind of a release, I guess, for our guilt energies. We're not innocent. Okay, so we have to start right here. But it's amazing what you can do right here. Okay, that's the education side. Getting the information, getting it out, supporting those small groups like the Jesuit Center and others, struggling against great odds by subscribing to their literature, by passing it around, by talking to people one by one, by bringing them in here. You see, here's 100 people getting this tremendous weekend of information. It's rather sad that there weren't 400 and 500 here. Why are they not here? You know, I like to think that next time you'll all be out there recruiting more people to bring them to these events. So I want to talk very positively. I don't want to lay a guilt trip on you. The other thing, believe it or not, when we ask the Latin Americans what we can do for you, they say, pray for us. I mean, these people know where the real values are because they don't know if they'll be alive next week. And they are deeply religious people. And nothing gives them more strength than to know that there are people who care out there, who are praying, and let them know that you're praying for them. Send messages. For instance, the delightful practice that some groups have engaged in of carrying cards down from school children to school children. Just greetings. Send down messages of greetings. The big word there is solidarity. Let them know that you're in solidarity with them, because nothing strengthens them like knowing that they're not alone. And then get involved personally in things like what's happening here and in all those initiatives that a number of groups propose to you. There's some in the back room there that tell you some of the things you can do. It's amazing the power you can exercise. And finally, and here I'm going to be deliberately very short, I'd like to come back to this topic later. Get involved. There is such a thing as getting involved locally in a whole process, what I would call a methodology of transforming society. And I know this is not the place to speak of it. I just want to come back to that a little later, because there are things we can do, and there is a specific procedure born out of experience right here in our Canadian context, whereby we can effectively bring about the transformation of society. But that's for another time.
Lois?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when? I think the first thing is to recognize is that we're in an historical process, and we have to ask how change takes place. Sometimes it takes place by revolution. More commonly, it takes place over a longer period of time. So I mean, I think that the question all of us are going to be asking this weekend is, what do we do? But I guess my feeling is that there are no quick fixes. One puts one's life in touch with certain historical movements, and who do you think you are anyway? You may be dead before there is any significant change, but it's important that you align your life with those movements which are, in fact, affecting social change. In terms of the numbers here, you know, I just came back from China, and I discovered to my astonishment that 0.08 of the population of China are Christians, and 0.08 of the population of China are communists. So you don't need a heck of a lot of people to really make significant change, and we need to know that. And I think we're bullied by numbers, and we're bullied by how many were there. And if there are 500 more bodies, that doesn't mean to say it's going to be a better meeting. It just means there are more bodies, and it may mean we feel better. Gregory Baum has an interesting article on the whole thing of why the prophetic message is resisted by the churches, in which he says that quite often when we talk about these things, we feel personal guilt. And he says, I hope that that isn't true, because so much of what we've been talking about is not because of something we have specifically done. It is in fact a corporate thing, and what we need to do is be free enough of the guilt to look at a tough analysis of the situation. Like some reading is in order, and that's part of our educative process, so don't let your guilt obscure that. In terms of the three sources that I use for a continuing analysis of Latin America and the Northern Hemisphere, I go to three interchurch coalitions. I think the ecumenical coalitions we have are one of the best sources. There is the Latin American Working Group, there is the Interchurch Committee on Human Rights in Latin America, and there is GATFLY, which I've quoted from this morning. All three of these groups, which happen to be based in Toronto, do have publications to which you can subscribe, cheaper than Maclean's, better than Maclean's, more regularly than Maclean's, and they will give you that analysis. There's no mystery about it, folks. Pay your money and they'll send you the stuff. And like, you really need to do that, get your name on those mailing lists, and keep abreast of the developments there. The third thing I would say is that usually it's most productive to act first and then figure out what you're doing. I mean, like, go out, invite your local banker out for coffee and discuss these things, and he will absolutely lambaste you, and you wonder, why did I do that? What am I talking about? But boy, that will make you want to read that GATFLY stuff. Because then you'll have to figure out, like, what he says is quite right. And so, I mean, I don't know what I'm doing here. I would suggest that you do that. That will motivate you to your own education. And also you might think about when a member of your congregation, maybe you have somebody who's a president of a multinational who's being shipped to Malaysia to run a TV electronics factory, and you might raise for the congregation what your corporate responsibility is in terms of this person's preparation. Are you simply going to say, send us lots of slides and gosh, isn't that exciting, you know, wow, Malaysia? Or are you going to get the information on Malaysia, on the kind of operation he's going to be administering, and really help that person exercise his Christian responsibility in that new situation? So often we simply send them off with a great party and say, isn't it nice, we'll watch your slides when you come back, without understanding that when he was baptized, we promised to contribute to his Christian education. So there's that whole nurturing of the people our congregation send into the international community. So those three things.
I just wanted to put in a plug for the Castlegar Central America group. Some of you may know about that already, but they're a very strong group with all kinds of suggestions for local action. And I think the particular focus right now is on Guatemala. I can give you the name of Ann Goderis, 365-5077 as a contact number. Ann would have been here, but she can't come and I'm in her place.
Want to get that number again?
Okay, 365-5077. And her address is on little cards with the Guatemala crafts in the back room. And just to add to that in terms of small groups, when I was talking about Fort Erie and the 200 people involved sheltering refugees, that all started because 4 people in a Bible study listened to one immigration officer talk about some of his guilt at having to enforce a law he didn't believe in, but his hands were tied because he had a mortgage, etc. But those other 3 went out and told the story and got practically the whole community involved. So my thing is to start with really small groups of people, make friends, and make a commitment to listen to each other and to what's important.
Yeah, 2 brief examples. One of things you did. Now, this is Canadian people doing something, and another of what you can do right now today. First example, capital punishment. People like yourselves turned this around. The powers that be were determined to bring back capital punishment. And the popular opinion of people like yourselves in Canada said, no way. And you stopped the return of capital punishment. I know because I was pretty close, and Lois knows what was going on in Ottawa, and it looked very much like the government was going to ram it through. Second example, you probably heard on the news, the Senate has defied the government on the generic drug bill. Now get in there, every one of you today, and support the Senate. See, now there's a classic example. This is legislation that's being rammed down the throats of Canadians without information. It's a clear attack on the poor. The multinationals are going to make millions of dollars by reserving their patents on generic drugs for 10 years, which means that ordinary medication is going to cost the poor far more than it should, as much as 10 times more than it should. Canada is one of the most advanced countries on that point in terms of inexpensive medication for the poor. That's all going down the drain if the government goes through with its present bill. The Senate has refused that bill, first time in history apparently, and now it's a showdown between the government and the Senate. The people of Canada have to support the Senate and say we do not want the multinationals ripping off the poor of Canada on that generic drug issue. There's something very concrete. It's got to be done right now.
30 seconds.
In 30 seconds,
Don't get too close to the mic.
Oh, okay. While Central America is fighting for their land, we're giving our water away, and I couldn't believe the sale of West Kootenay Power and Light. That just boggled my mind coming home this summer. So I'm sure some of you are involved with that issue, even to keep publicizing it after the fact. So keep it up.
And if you want the address of these great publications that you're better than Maclean's, write me at the Ecumenical Forum, 11 Madison Avenue. It's also on the Gatfly booklet back there. You can get the address, and I'll tell you the other addresses.
What's the McLean's address, by the way?
I don't know what McLean's address is. I don't carry it next to my heart.
Okay, question from group 3 and 4.
Standing at the back by the
I'm
pillar.
sorry. Okay. The phone numbers from the senators?
Of the senators. Yeah.
That's a good practical question.
Right.
Good.
All right.
Dial 1-613-555-1212. Information Ottawa. They'll give it to you.
Good. Question from group 3 and 4. How can we persuade people that everyone can and must play a part in worldwide development and peace? Another easy question. Lois?
My thesis is that worldwide development and peace is, it's an indivisible issue from everything else we've been talking about. And if you're active at all in ecology, in the women's movement, in the peace movement, in many of those things which are really counter to the mainstream, you're making your contribution to the peace movement. I think the best way to persuade other people is to do what you believe in. They do sometimes notice what you're doing, particularly your kids.
Well, I simply want to support that because it's so important. It's start doing something yourself. Because you do not convert people with ideas. You've probably heard that one before. Ideas never convert people. It's just that people don't live indefinitely.
Not up to now, anyway.
Right. So new ideas come along. But the new ideas come out of experience, not of rationalizing. I don't think I've ever changed anybody's mind by arguing or rationalizing. But get involved and show them something else. Show and tell is maybe the simplest answer. Do things differently, and that will impact on people. And by experiencing different things, their ideas will change, not by arguing.
Although I haven't made any comments, I'd like to just say that I've just come back from Thailand, and one of the most encouraging things that I found there were a number of small groups of students and others who are saying no to the spread of militarism in that part of the world. And for those who'd be interested, I brought back some photographs of public demonstrations made by students in Bangkok to something called Defense Asia 87, a very large arms bazaar for that part of the world, organized from Singapore. And these students didn't just ram off a flyer, as we are accustomed to do in Ottawa when there's an arms bazaar there. They spent a week preparing for this at Thomas University. They developed very large, very elaborate, and very well done posters, signs, one big one saying defense by development, not armaments, both in Thai and in English. They had peace kites. They had demonstrations of students getting killed by grenades. And they had very effective posters showing on one side a large tank which was flipped over and demonstrated how many hospitals could be built with the money going into the arms race in Thailand. I'll pass this around if those of you would be interested, because it's a concrete example of people that are working in duress. They're working in a country in which the military is dominant still, although not a dictatorship, but it is a dominant place. There are small groups in different parts of Thailand, as there are now in different parts of Asia, that are demonstrating and showing their concern that they want nonviolent alternatives to the problems that they face.
But just as a postscript to that, I find it interesting, we received word in July through the Canadian Asian Working Group, which is another church coalition, of the arrest of a number of key Catholic workers in community organization in Singapore, who no doubt were into this. They were arrested, accused of being communists, Unfortunately, the Catholic bishop appeared on television with the governor and in opposition to them. He did not support them.
Is that right?
No.
Yeah. Okay, question from group 5 and 6. What can we do to help create a more just global economic system?
I guess my first thing would be to do some self-education so that you understand what needs to happen and are clear in those objectives.
Also remember, the majority of the people on this planet do not live according to the formal economy. It's good to remember that. You see, our media, television, press, radio, etc., are so conditioned by our Western culture that takes for granted that everybody lives by dollars and by transactions of what we call the formal economy. You know, the gross national product, which in many cases is really gross, that we think this applies to the whole world. It doesn't. If you go into the mountains, for instance, in the Andes or in certain parts of Africa or India, you will find millions of people who survive in an informal economy that has nothing to do with the gross national product. But of course, they don't get into the media. So education to realize that, first of all, that the global issue is not as defined by our Western culture based on the market economy. Secondly, with the breakdown of our economic system right here in Canada, getting worse, a minority of rich, upwardly mobile people getting richer, and an increasing majority of people getting poorer, including the middle class, which is now sinking into poverty,